Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Morphy Auction Company up in Pennsylvania taking a look at a post-World War II commercial submachine gun. This is a Bernardelli Model VB and it looks very much like a Beretta. In fact, it looks like the Beretta Model 38. Now, Beretta started making that gun in 1938. It was a fantastic submachine gun and it would stay in production throughout World War II, getting simplified bit by bit. And then after the war, Beretta continued to manufacture it. They gave it a different name. They called it like they had a series of names for it, starting with the Beretta Model 4. Fundamentally the same gun as from the end of World War II, but they gave it a new name so it sounded newer and fancier and, not old war surplus. This is our brand new thing. Well, the Bernardelli company decided to try and get in on the action and built a gun that is, externally at least, very, very similar, but not quite the same. We're going to go ahead and compare this to a post-war Beretta and see how it's different and how it's not. So let's just dig right into that. So in a nutshell, submachine gun. It is like the Beretta, has a bolt handle on the right side and ejects out the left side, which is a bit unusual. Single trigger, very Italian style of stock. The magazine is a Beretta Model 38 pattern, which was standard for all the Italian military submachine guns in World War II. Makes sense that they would have continued to use that. However, this is kind of where the similarities end. So let's bring in an actual Beretta. This is a post-war commercial production Beretta Model 4, and let's see how these two actually compare. When I put these side by side, I think a couple major differences immediately jump out. So these are clearly not straight copies of each other because the Bernardelli actually has a substantially shorter receiver and also a longer barrel. It has a different ejection port to it. As I said, these are both guns that have right side charging handles, but the Beretta has an ejection port that's mostly on the left side of the receiver, where the Bernardelli has an ejection port that's mostly on the top. They're very clearly not the same, and you'll notice that the ejectors, or the extractors, on the bolt are in different positions to match those ejection ports. The rear of the receiver is also substantially different. These have totally different disassembly mechanisms, although both require the stock to be removed, so we'll take a look at that in just a moment. Note, however, that we have a recess cut in the stock of the Bernardelli here for the tube, which we do not have in the Beretta. Other than that, the stocks do follow the same basic pattern. Interesting that this Bernardelli, straight from the factory, does not have the rear sling bar, which the Beretta does. This is an Italian military style or pattern of stock. Also notice we don't have any hand grooves, finger grooves in the Bernardelli, which we do have in the Beretta. Now the World War II military patterns of the Beretta had a selector switch here for safe and fire, and then two triggers, one for full auto, one for semi-auto. In the post-war incarnation they kept the dual triggers, but they went to a cross-bolt style of safety. The Bernardelli has that selector lever, much like the wartime Berettas. However, it has a single trigger, and we have a safe, semi-full lever here, a three-position lever. So different than the Beretta was in the first place, and also different than the post-war Beretta. We have different muzzle devices. This is the same as the wartime Beretta pattern, or late war Beretta pattern, with just a two-port muzzle brake built into the barrel, where on the Bernardelli we have a 5-slot brake there. Also a hooded sight, which the Berettas did not have. The rear sights are of the same basic type, but obviously not interchangeable. And by the way, the only markings on the Bernardelli are these proof marks here on the back of the receiver. It doesn't actually say Bernardelli on it anywhere. We know it is for a number of reasons, most notable of which is the fact that this particular one is in its original Bernardelli shipping box that says Vincenzo Bernardelli all over it. The only other marking we have here, aside from a serial number down there, is this, upside down, import mark. And that's Springfield Geneseo, and that's because this is a machine gun that was imported into the US, so that was added when it was imported. The cocking handles on the two guns are quite different. A round knob on the Beretta, including also a dust cover over the slot for the charging handle. The Bernardelli does away with that cover, and it's just a simple sort of blade lug style of charging handle. And As we get towards disassembly, we look to the underside with the trigger guard, and what we find here is that the Beretta has screws and lock screws holding the trigger guard on, and removing this is part of the disassembly process, where on the Bernardelli there are no screws here. This is actually pinned onto the receiver, and the disassembly process for this instead requires tapping out this pin right there, which then allows the stock to come off. To disassemble the Beretta, I take these screws out, which I've already done. I then have to remove this side of the safety. Then, almost had those out. With the screws out, then the trigger guard comes off, and I can access the receiver. Now on the Bernardelli, we have to punch this pin out. There we go. Pull that the rest of the way. And then the stock comes off. The rear pin for this trigger guard is very loose, so that just falls out every time I do this. And now we have the receiver. On the Beretta, the next step is to remove this end cap. We're going to rotate it. It will depress this button, and then once we rotate it about 90 degrees, it will come off. There we go, with a very strong recoil spring inside. And then I can pull the bolt out. Going back to the Bernardelli, I have a plunger here. I have to push that plunger in, and then I rotate this cap 90 degrees. Push that, there we go. And as I rotate this, you can see this thing lines up with the little slot at the back. And once it's down there, then I can slide it down that way. There is a spring inside there as well, but this one is a much smaller spring, just asking to get kinked with a little some rubber polymer buffer pad in there. And then I pull the bolt back to here, pull the charging handle out, and I can pull out the bolt. So I think you can see that these have substantially different internal parts. Definitely not interchangeable, if for no other reason than the fact that the sear engagement surfaces are at different points on these two different bolts. If we look at the front of the bolts, you can see again the difference in position of the extractor. This is the Bernardelli, that's the Beretta. So what Bernardelli did here is not actually to copy the Beretta 38 pattern, or 38, 42, or 44 post-war. They copied more or less the external appearance of the gun, but then made all of the internal parts substantially different. The trigger assembly is different, the receiver is different, the barrel's different, the bolt's different, the recoil system is different, the disassembly method and the end of the receiver plug are different, the bolt handle's different, the stock attachment method is different. Really, fundamentally, everything about this is a different submachine gun. The question is, was this successful? Did they manage to sell these? In the years just following World War II, Bernardelli tried to break into a bunch of new markets. They, for example, tried producing submachine guns that were kind of blatantly swiped from Beretta. This turned out to be a commercial failure. They made about 500 of these in 1948 and 49, failed to develop any sort of real effective market for them, and gave up. Right about the same time, they also experimented with 9mm parabellum service pistols. I actually have a separate video on a couple of those. That project was even less successful. They made even fewer of those in a couple of different patterns before giving up. They did manage to produce and find some success with small caliber, like 25 and 32 caliber pocket pistols. So that ended up being the thing that carried Bernardelli through. Ultimately, they went bankrupt in the 1990s and were bought out by a big Turkish gun company. So This is a really cool example of something Bernardelli tried to pull off in the 40s. It's an interesting submachine gun, particularly interesting in comparison to the Beretta, because I think most people assume that this is just a copy of the Beretta, when it really is substantially different in many, if not most, of the actual little details. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.